Going back to when you're somewhere between 8 and 11, who are the authors that switch you on?
They're fairly well-known ones, with maybe one or two exceptions. And I used to make lists of my favorite books when I was this age. And they would change a little bit through the years, but the top 10 were pretty consistent and pretty popular. For instance, once I discovered the Narnia Chronicles, one or more of the Narnia books was always on the top of the list or near the top of the list. I loved A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle when I got to it in 5th grade. I loved Harriet the Spy by Louise Fitzhugh, which I also got to in about 5th grade. Indeed, Harriet the Spy is the only one of my favorite books from childhood that was not a fantasy. I really loved reading magic books, as I called them. But Harriet the Spy was a realistic story about a child who wanted to be a writer and therefore she needed to spy on the world in order to know how it worked. And I so admired that book that I took some clues from Harriet, the character, about how to be a spy and how to be a writer. And I started my own journal when I was in 6th grade. And here I am, is it 50 years later? Just almost 50 years later. And I still am keeping that same journal. I have never stopped keeping a journal, thanks to Harriet the Spy, a way of looking at the world, looking at myself, and seeing how I fit. But one or two other of my favorite books. I loved Half Magic by Edward Eger. And I also loved a book that I wonder whether any of your attendees will ever have heard of. It's a little less popular now than it was when I was a kid. It's called The Diamond in the Window by Jane Langton. It's a magic story, a fantasy, set in an old Victorian house in the town of Concord, Massachusetts. And it's simultaneously a dream adventure and a treasure hunt and a story of being hunted and endangered by a bad item in the world. And I loved it to pieces. I loved it to pieces. Indeed, here I am in Concord, Massachusetts, many years later. I loved it so much, I actually met the author, and she lived near here, and I moved to Boston, and not so I could live near her, but because I was enamored by that book. And now I live in Concord, Massachusetts, and have raised my family here, all because of something that I read when I was in 5th grade or 4th grade.
So when you meet your hero, that's a good idea, or you're shaking all over, and she says something terrible to you, and you're crushed forever.
That does happen, and meaning no disrespect to that venerable woman who now has passed away. She did once say something to me that she didn't mean unkindly, but that I took to be a kind of a brush off, and I was crushed. And later on, when I told her about it, she reared up and said, "Oh, no, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that." She was using a kind of social convention that I didn't understand. I was terribly earnest and from a different socioeconomic bracket, and I just didn't know. I didn't know that she was speaking casually, and I thought she was saying, "Don't, enough of this. Don't bother me anymore." So that was crushing. But you're young. You have to learn nuance. You have to learn the conventions of conversation, and they differ from generation to generation and from place to place in the world. I grew up in New York, so how Boston Yankee people were was a very different way from how upstate New Yorkers were, and I had to learn.